It was the coldest night of the year when 14-year-old Lila Daniels was thrown out of her family's house. The wind howled through the skeletal trees as she stood on the front porch, her suitcase clutched tightly in trembling hands. Her stepmother, Margaret, loomed in the doorway, her face twisted in disgust. "You've shamed this family, Lila," Margaret hissed, her voice low and venomous. "We won't let you drag us down with your sins." Lila's father stood behind Margaret, silent and defeated, his gaze fixed on the floor. The man who had once read her bedtime stories now wouldn't even meet her eyes. "Daddy?" Lila's voice cracked. "Please don't let her do this." But he said nothing. With a final glance at her father, Lila turned and stumbled down the steps, her tears freezing on her cheeks as she disappeared into the night. For hours, Lila wandered aimlessly through the darkened streets, her mind swirling with panic and despair. The reality of her situation hit her in waves. No home, no family, and no idea where to go. The weight of her small suitcase and the growing ache in her stomach only deepened her hopelessness. As the night dragged on, she found herself on the outskirts of town, where the abandoned properties of old coal miners stood like eerie monuments to a forgotten past. Her breath formed ghostly clouds in the icy air as she stumbled across a dilapidated cabin nestled among the trees. The cabin was a hulking silhouette against the moonlit sky, its windows shattered and its wooden walls warped with age. But it was shelter, and Lila had no other choice. Inside, the air was heavy with dampness and decay. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and cobwebs draped the corners like dusty shrouds. But in the center of the room stood a fireplace, its iron grate surprisingly intact. She set her suitcase down and scavenged the room for anything flammable, eventually finding a pile of dry wood hidden under a collapsed shelf. With trembling hands, she struck a match from her pocket and lit a small fire. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the walls, and for the first time that night, Lila felt a shred of safety. She wrapped her coat tightly around her and drifted into a restless sleep. Lila awoke to the sound of whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the cabin's walls. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized the whispers were low and rhythmic, almost like a chant. They seemed to emanate from beneath the floorboards, rising and falling in eerie harmony. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving the cabin in a deafening silence. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the room, her fire reduced to smoldering embers. She told herself it was her imagination, a product of exhaustion and fear. But as she lay back down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The first nightmare came that night. Lila found herself standing in the middle of the cabin, but it was no longer abandoned. The walls were clean, the windows whole, and the air filled with the smell of fresh-baked bread. A woman hummed softly in the kitchen, her face hidden as she stirred a pot on the stove. "Hello," Lila ventured, her voice echoing unnaturally. The woman stopped humming. Slowly, she turned to face Lila, and her features became a grotesque blur, as though her face were melting. The woman's head tilted at an unnatural angle, and her mouth opened impossibly wide. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman rasped in a voice that wasn't human. Lila woke up screaming. The fire had gone out completely, and the room was plunged into darkness. She could still hear the rasp of the woman's voice in her ears, and for a moment, she was paralyzed with terror. Then she heard it again, the whispers. Determined to leave the cabin at first light, Lila spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, her back pressed against the wall. When the sun finally rose, she packed her things and stepped outside, her breath visible in the frigid morning air. But as she turned to leave, something caught her eye. Near the edge of the cabin, partially buried in the dirt, was a weathered wooden box. Intrigued and desperate for distraction, she dug it out with her hands. The box was locked, but the rusted clasp crumbled easily under pressure. Inside, she found an assortment of items: a leather-bound journal, a tarnished silver locket, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded red ribbon. The letters were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was elegant but uneven, as though written in haste. Lila opened the journal first. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles, detailing the life of a woman named Eleanor who had once lived in the cabin. Eleanor wrote about a series of strange events that began after her husband unearthed a peculiar artifact while digging in the nearby woods. "It whispers to me at night," one entry read. "I see them in my dreams, the shadows with no faces. They watch me, waiting for something." Lila's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The final entry was short and scrawled as though in panic. "It wants the child. God help us all." Lila couldn't explain the dread that settled over her after reading the journal. She tried to shake it off, reasoning that it was just an old book filled with the ramblings of a lonely woman. But as she ventured into town to scavenge for food, the feeling stayed with her, like a dark cloud hanging over her. The townspeople avoided her, their gazes hard and suspicious. She overheard whispers about the Daniels girl and her scandal, but no one offered her help. By the time she returned to the cabin, her spirits were crushed. That night, the whispers were louder. Lila pressed her hands over her ears, but it did little to block out the sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, growing in intensity until it was a deafening cacophony. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in on her, the shadows stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the whispers stopped. In the silence that followed, Lila heard a single, distinct sound, the creak of a floorboard behind her. The creak of the floorboard echoed in the suffocating silence of the cabin. Lila froze, her breath caught in her throat, her body too terrified to move. Slowly, she turned her head toward the sound. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to thicken, taking on a shape, a figure that was tall and featureless. Then it stepped forward. The figure moved without sound, gliding toward her as if it floated just above the ground. Lila stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. Her feet caught on the edge of the fireplace, and she fell, sprawling onto the cold, hard floor. "Stay back," she screamed, grabbing a piece of broken wood from the hearth. She brandished it like a weapon, but the figure didn't stop. It bent its shapeless form toward her, and for the briefest moment, Lila thought she heard a faint voice coming from it, like the echo of a child's cry. And then it disappeared. Morning came, but the light did little to dispel the terror Lila felt. She hadn't slept a wink, too afraid to close her eyes after the encounter. Every noise, every shifting shadow had her on edge. But the cabin was quiet now, almost oppressively so. The once familiar sounds of creaking wood and wind through the cracks were absent, leaving a vacuum of sound that pressed against her ears. Determined to make sense of the previous night, Lila returned to the box she had unearthed. The journal lay on the floor where she had dropped it. She picked it up, flipping through the pages again in search of answers. "It isn't just in my dreams anymore," Eleanor had written. "It touches me now, cold and sharp like knives on my skin. I tried to leave, but the forest won't let me go." The mention of the forest sent a chill down Lila's spine. She had passed through the woods on her way to the cabin, and though the trees had seemed ordinary, she remembered feeling a sense of unease, as if she were being watched. But the most unnerving part of the journal was yet to come. Toward the back, Eleanor had sketched a crude map of the cabin and its surroundings. She had marked a spot beneath the cabin with the words, "Do not open the door." The idea of a hidden door beneath the cabin filled Lila with equal parts curiosity and dread. She couldn't ignore the possibility that it held answers, but she also couldn't shake Eleanor's warning. Still, with nothing else to cling to, she began searching. Hours later, after moving furniture and prying up loose floorboards, she found it, a trapdoor concealed beneath a layer of dirt and debris. It was old, the wood warped and splintered, but the iron handle was intact. Her fingers hovered over the handle, hesitating. She thought about the figure she'd seen, the whispers, and the warnings in the journal. But something deeper, a pull she couldn't explain, compelled her to open it. With a grunt, she heaved the trapdoor open. The air that rose from below was cold and damp, carrying with it the faint smell of rot. A set of narrow stairs descended into darkness, the space beyond impenetrable to the faint light filtering through the cabin's broken windows. Lila lit one of the candles she'd found in the cabin and carefully descended the stairs. The flame flickered wildly, casting strange shapes on the dirt walls. The basement was larger than she'd expected, with a low ceiling and the remnants of what appeared to be an old root cellar. But it was the markings on the walls that caught her attention. Strange symbols, etched deeply into the dirt, spiraled and overlapped in chaotic patterns. They seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The sight made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to look closer. At the far end of the basement was a wooden door, partially rotted and hanging crookedly on its hinges. This must have been the door Eleanor had warned about. Lila approached it cautiously, the candle shaking in her hand. The closer she got, the louder the whispers became. They weren't coming from behind the door, but from all around her, as if the walls themselves were alive and speaking. The voices were indistinct, a chorus of murmurs layered on top of one another. But one phrase stood out, repeated over and over. "It's not your time." Lila's heart raced. She reached for the door's handle, but before she could touch it, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The candle went out, plunging her into darkness. Lila scrambled back up the stairs, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She slammed the trapdoor shut and piled furniture on top of it, as if that could keep whatever was down there from following her. But the whispers had stopped, and the cabin was eerily quiet once again. She tried to rationalize what she had experienced. Maybe it was the lack of food, the stress, or even the pregnancy. But deep down, she knew it was something else. Something wrong. Over the next few days, the cabin's strange occurrences escalated. Objects moved on their own, a chair shifting across the floor, the journal flipping open to random pages. The fire refused to stay lit, and the air grew colder with each passing hour. Worst of all were the mirrors. Though the cabin had only one small, cracked mirror in the bathroom, Lila began seeing her reflection in other surfaces, windows, puddles, even the shiny metal of a spoon. But the reflections weren't hers. They were distorted, with hollow eyes and mouths twisted in silent screams. Desperate for help, Lila decided to take the journal into town and show it to anyone who might have answers. But when she reached the edge of the forest, she found herself back at the cabin. She tried again, taking a different path, but no matter which direction she went, the forest twisted and turned her back. It was as Eleanor had written, "The forest won't let me go." Realizing she was trapped, Lila returned to the cabin, her hope dwindling. She opened the journal one last time, her eyes scanning for anything she might have missed. That's when she found it, an entry written in a darker ink, barely legible beneath the scribbles of the previous page. "The child is the key." It's always been about the child. Lila's blood ran cold as she placed a hand on her stomach. The forest whispered secrets Lila wasn't ready to hear. Though the sunlight dappled the ground in patches, its warmth never reached her skin. The trees stood as silent sentinels, their gnarled branches seeming to form grotesque shapes in the dimming light. No matter how far she ventured from the cabin, she always found herself circling back. Days bled together as Lila's attempts to leave became increasingly desperate. She marked trees, thinking she'd found her way, only to stumble upon the same markings an hour later. She screamed into the endless green, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. Her dreams were worse. Each night she saw the figure from the cabin. Its shadow loomed over her, its head tilting unnaturally as it whispered unintelligible phrases. Sometimes it was in the cabin with her, standing over her as she slept, its icy breath brushing against her face. Other times, she dreamed of a woman she didn't recognize, a gaunt figure with hollow cheeks and haunted eyes, clutching a crying infant. The woman's voice, though weak and cracking, repeated a single plea, "Save me." When Lila woke, the sensation of being watched lingered. The cabin's walls seemed to close in on her, the air thick and suffocating. She tried to distract herself by reading Eleanor's journal again, combing through the cryptic entries for anything, that could help her escape. Toward the back of the journal, Lila discovered a passage she hadn't noticed before. The ink was smudged, the words shaky as if written by a trembling hand. I tried to end it today. I thought if I took the knife, it would stop. But the forest wouldn't let me. The cabin wouldn't let me. Every time I pressed the blade to my skin, I heard the child crying. She needs me, but I don't know how to save her. The shadows grow stronger every day. They feed on fear. They feed on her. The word her was underlined so many times it tore through the page. Lila's fingers trembled as she closed the journal, her mind racing. Eleanor's desperation mirrored her own. But who was her? And why was the cabin so fixated on the unborn child? That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They weren't coming from the walls this time. They were rising from beneath the floorboards, from the trapdoor Lila had sealed. She sat curled up in a corner, her hands pressed to her ears, but the sound seemed to bypass her defenses, reverberating directly in her mind. Lila, Lila. The way her name was spoken, slow and drawn out, almost a sigh, sent chills down her spine. Against her better judgment, she approached the trapdoor, her steps slow and deliberate. Open it. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the furniture she'd piled on top of the door. Her heart thundered in her chest, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt. Something deep within her, an instinct she couldn't explain, urged her to comply. With a shaking hand, she moved the furniture aside and opened the trapdoor. The cold air that rushed up from below was thicker this time, almost suffocating. The whispers subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. Lila descended the stairs once more, candle in hand. The basement looked the same as before, the strange symbols, the damp dirt walls, and the rotting door at the far end. But now, there was something new, a trail of tiny, childlike footprints in the dirt, leading straight to the door. "Who's there?" Lila called, her voice wavering. The silence was her only response. She followed the footprints, her candle casting flickering light on the walls. When she reached the door, she placed her hand on it, hesitating. "Help me." The voice was faint, muffled, and undeniably coming from the other side of the door. It sounded like a child, and Lila's heart broke at the sorrow in the voice. Against Eleanor's warning, she opened the door. The space beyond was wrong. It wasn't a room but a void, pitch black and infinite, its edges impossible to define. The footprints continued into the darkness, and as Lila stepped inside, the air grew colder. The whispers started again, this time louder and more distinct, their words overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear and anger. "She's ours. You can't save her. The child belongs to us." Lila spun around, the candle trembling in her grip. Shadows moved within the void, too fast for her to focus on. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was the woman from her dreams. The woman was translucent, her form flickering like a poorly tuned television. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, and her lips cracked and bloodied. She reached out a hand toward Lila, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Please," Eleanor rasped. "You have to stop it." "Stop what?" Lila asked, her voice shaking. "What's happening? What is this place?" "The child," Eleanor said, her voice cracking. "They need the child. It's the only way they can leave. You have to protect her." Before Lila could ask more, the shadows surged forward, engulfing Eleanor. The woman's scream echoed through the void, a sound so raw and filled with pain that it made Lila's knees buckle. She stumbled backward, the candle slipping from her hand and extinguishing as it hit the ground. The darkness closed in around her, the whispers growing deafening. Lila screamed, her voice swallowed by the void. When she awoke, she was back in the cabin, sprawled on the floor near the trapdoor. The journal lay open beside her, its pages blank save for one new sentence scrawled in crimson ink. "You can't run. The forest won't let you. Protect the child, or we'll take her." Lila's hand instinctively went to her stomach. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Whatever force haunted the cabin and the forest wasn't just after her. It was after her baby. She had no choice but to fight back. The cabin seemed to pulse with a dark energy after Lila's encounter in the void. Every creak of the floorboards, Every flicker of the candlelight felt heavy with intention. It was as if the entire structure was alive, its breath synchronized with her shallow gasps. The journal's ominous warning echoed in her mind, over and over. Protect the child, or we'll take her. Lila began to notice changes in her surroundings. The forest outside no longer seemed indifferent to her presence. It was malevolent. The rustling of leaves sounded like whispers, and shadows moved in ways that defied logic. When she tried to venture out to gather supplies, she felt an invisible barrier pushing her back, as if the woods themselves were conspiring to keep her confined. She couldn't ignore the subtle but growing movements in her belly. Her child was alive, a faint flutter reminding her that she wasn't alone. Yet this reassurance came with a chilling realization. The entities knew too. Every time she touched her stomach, the whispers grew louder, almost frantic. Desperate for answers, Lila scoured the journal once more, hoping to uncover some clue to free herself and her unborn child. She read each page meticulously, her eyes scanning the faded ink for patterns or hidden meanings. Near the end of the journal, she found a passage that chilled her to the bone. The child bears the mark. I didn't see it at first, but it was there just beneath the surface. They've chosen her. They've waited centuries for this. The curse began long before me, before us all. The forest demands blood, and the cabin is its altar. The child is the key to their freedom or to their destruction. Lila's hand instinctively moved to her stomach. Was this mark metaphorical, or was there something physical tying her baby to the horrors of the cabin? That night, Lila was plagued by vivid dreams, or perhaps visions. She saw the cabin as it once was, a bustling home filled with laughter and warmth. A family of 5 lived there, a mother, father, and their 3 children. The youngest, a little girl with golden curls, seemed to glow with a light that drew everyone to her. But the dream shifted. The once bright home became shrouded in darkness. The family was gone, replaced by shadows that writhed and slithered along the walls. The golden-haired girl stood alone in the center of the room, her light dimming as the shadows encroached upon her. A disembodied voice echoed through the air. She belongs to us? When Lila woke, tears streamed down her face. The girl in her dream, so innocent, so radiant, was no different than her own unborn child. The whispers grew louder as the days dragged on, now forming coherent sentences that filled Lila's mind whether she was awake or asleep. Give her to us, and you'll go free. Your life for hers. It's the only way. At first, Lila screamed at the voices, her defiance a flimsy shield against the overwhelming fear. But as the whispers persisted, she began to feel the weight of their offer. She was alone, isolated, and powerless against the forces that surrounded her. Was there truly no other way? One night, the whispers crescendoed, and a shadowy figure materialized in the corner of the cabin. Unlike the fleeting shapes in the forest, this one was solid, towering, with elongated limbs and a featureless face. Its presence was suffocating, the air growing colder with each passing second. Decide, it rasped, its voice a low growl that seemed to reverberate through her bones. The child's life or yours? Lila clutched her stomach, her voice trembling. She's mine. You can't have her. The figure tilted its head, as if considering her words. Then, with a guttural laugh, it dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind a chilling warning. You'll regret this. Determined to find answers, Lila focused on the symbols etched into the cabin's walls and the basement. She copied them into a notebook, hoping they might hold the key to understanding the curse. As she worked, flashes of Eleanor's ghostly image appeared in her mind. Her frantic gestures, her mournful eyes. One symbol, in particular, seemed to dominate her visions, a spiral encased in jagged lines. The image burned itself into her thoughts, and she realized it matched the strange, faint birthmark on her abdomen, something she'd always dismissed as a coincidence. The mark, Eleanor's voice whispered in her mind. It binds you to them, but it can also break them. Eleanor's cryptic words only deepened Lila's confusion. Was her child the key to ending the curse, Or would she doom them both by fighting back? As Lila pieced together fragments of the truth, the forest grew increasingly hostile. One morning, she awoke to find claw marks gouged into the walls of the cabin. The scratches spelled out a single word: leave. But leaving wasn't an option. Every time she stepped beyond the cabin's threshold, the forest twisted and turned, trapping her in an endless loop. The voices in the trees mocked her efforts, their laughter a haunting melody. You can't escape. The forest owns you. Give us the child. One evening, Lila heard a loud crash outside. Peering through the window, she saw the ancient oak near the cabin's entrance split in two, its exposed heart blackened and oozing a thick, tar-like substance. The sight sent a shiver down her spine. Nature itself was warning her of what was to come. Despite the mounting terror, Lila's determination solidified. She couldn't let the entities take her child, no matter the cost. She spent her nights studying Eleanor's journal and the symbols, hoping to find a way to break the curse. One entry stood out. The curse can't be destroyed, only transferred. A willing sacrifice is the only way to spare the child. The weight of the words settled on her like a stone. If she wanted to save her baby, she might have to offer herself in her place. But even that wasn't guaranteed to work. What if the forest refused her sacrifice? What if it demanded more? As her resolve strengthened, so too did the forest's wrath. The nights grew longer, the whispers louder, and the shadows bolder. Lila knew the final confrontation was near. The cabin was no longer just a prison, it was a battlefield. Lila could feel the oppressive energy coiling tighter around her and her unborn child. The whispers, now unrelenting, echoed through her thoughts, even in moments of silence. But it wasn't just the entities outside the cabin she feared. Something dark stirred within her as well. Lila's days were consumed by deciphering Eleanor's journal and the cryptic symbols carved into the cabin walls. She pieced together fragments of stories, each revealing more about the curse that bound her. The journal spoke of a bloodline tainted by betrayal, a lineage marked by deals with ancient forces in exchange for power and protection. The first betrayal came with blood. One passage read, "The sacrifice of an innocent child to appease the forest spirits." It was supposed to end there, but the curse thrives on cycles. Each generation must pay its due, or the spirits will claim them all. Lila's breath hitched as she connected the dots. Her pregnancy wasn't a random twist of fate. It was part of a pattern, a lineage cursed to perpetuate the forest's hunger. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was the latest in a long line of offerings. Eleanor's presence grew stronger with each passing day. Sometimes, Lila would see her reflection in the windows or feel her icy touch on her shoulder. In these moments, Eleanor's sorrow was palpable, her ghostly form weighed down by centuries of regret. "I didn't know what they wanted when they took my child," Eleanor whispered one night. Her voice was distant, like wind rustling through leaves. "I thought I could bargain, but the forest doesn't negotiate. It only takes." "Why are you helping me?" Lila asked, her voice trembling. "Because I see my child in yours," Eleanor replied. "And because I've failed too many times. You're the last chance to break this." The desperation in Eleanor's voice pierced Lila's heart. For the first time, she felt a kinship with the spectral figure, a shared anguish that transcended time. The strange birthmark on Lila's abdomen took on new significance. Eleanor explained that it was the mark of the cursed bloodline, a physical manifestation of the pact forged generations ago. But it wasn't just a symbol of doom, it was also a source of power. "The spiral binds you to them, but it also binds them to you," Eleanor said. "You can use it to weaken their hold, but only if you're willing to face the cost." "What cost?" Lila demanded. Eleanor's silence was answer enough. Whatever the cost, Lila knew it wouldn't be easy. One night, as Lila sat by the fire, a new voice joined the whispers, a soft, melodic tone that seemed to come from within her. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the crackling flames, but it grew louder with each heartbeat. "Mama," the voice said, clear and unmistakable. Lila froze, her hand flying to her stomach. Who's there?" "It's me." The voice replied. "I'm scared." Tears welled up in Lila's eyes. Her baby was speaking to her, reaching out from the safety of her womb. But how was this possible? Was it truly her child? Or was it another trick of the forest? "Don't be scared," Lila whispered, her voice shaking. "I'll protect you." The voice didn't respond, but Lila felt a warmth spread through her body, a fleeting moment of comfort in the midst of chaos. The entities didn't take kindly to Lila's growing defiance. The forest became a living nightmare, with trees twisting into grotesque shapes and shadows swarming like predators. One night, the cabin shook violently, as if caught in the grip of an earthquake. Windows shattered, and the walls groaned under an invisible